From the book Snow Angels by Harriet Loveday. Secret Santa. Sarah had worked at Port Enterprise for nearly 2 years. After the office reorganisation, Sarah had to change groups and was placed at a desk next to Kevan. Sarah had sat next to Kevan for 9 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, and she had been madly in love with him for 9 months, 3 weeks and 1 day. Kevan was tall, with dark blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes. He was intelligent and kind. He had a warm sense of humour which was reflected in his eyes. Kevan liked motorbikes and travelling. He would give people his undivided attention, stopping his work, turning to them and tuning the world out. It was a charming trait. Quite simply, to Sarah, he was perfect. It's just that he would never know how Sarah felt, because she could never tell him. Sarah had hazel eyes and red hair. She hated the curl in her hair, so she tried to straighten it every morning before work using an expensive straightening brush. It was the only luxury 10 minutes of time she allowed herself, as she was a busy mum to a darling little boy, and the mornings were always a rush. In every other way, Sarah was ordinary, kind, gentle, softly spoken, average height, average weight. In many ways, Sarah felt her son was her greatest achievement. Every day, Sarah diligently turned up to work, did her job, left at the same time every night, picked up her son and snuggled up with him at home. In nearly every way, Sarah was content and happy. She could afford the bills, and her little boy was her world. But one day he would grow up. As much as Sarah didn't consciously realise it, her son Connor needed a good father figure, and Sarah very much needed a kind, stable partner to share her world with. Each morning, Sarah arrived at the same time to her desk at work. Kevan was always there before her, typing away on some report or another. "Morning, Sarah," Kevan smiled and greeted her with a kind smile. "Morning, Kevan," Sarah replied with her own warm smile. Apart from picking her son up from school, this was her next favourite moment of the day. Sarah settled herself down at her desk, logged in, checked the most urgent emails, then left for a coffee from the coffee bean machine. Settling herself back at her desk, Kevan turned to Sarah, and they had their usual brief morning conversation about the news, or some amusing email from an imploding member of staff, or some funny story from Connor the night before. For a few minutes every day, Sarah and Kevan entered their happy bubble. Sometimes Kevan wanted to show Sarah something on his computer screen, and she got to move closer, inches away from him, as she craned to look where he directed. They'd once touched hands when she'd passed a leaving card to Kevan for him to sign. Their eyes connected and they'd shared a brief moment, but nothing had come of it. Sarah had lived on the moment of that touch for at least a week. As with all of these little moments and unsaid words, though, nothing had come of it. Christmas was just a few weeks away, and Abigail, whom Sarah didn't like that much, although she couldn't quite put her finger on why, suggested that their group do a Secret Santa this year. The idea was to put their names on pieces of paper, which were put into a pot, then pull out a different name and get the person an amusing Christmas gift for under £10. They'd open their Secret Santa presents just before their team Christmas lunch, which was organised at a nearby pub and booked just before they all left for their Christmas holidays. The team thought it was a fun idea and excitedly wrote their names on bits of paper to put in the pot. Abigail pulled out a piece of paper first. Without checking herself, she rolled her eyes in annoyance. Then quickly covering the act, she smiled and said too brightly, "Oh, I know exactly what to get this person." Kevan was next. He raised his eyebrows as he read the name, then refolded the paper. Sarah pulled her paper and read, "Darren Waterhouse." Darren handled the project management for the team. She'd have to think of something funny, but her mind went blank. Refolding the paper, she resolved that inspiration would come to her later. Abigail bounded around the members of their team sat at their desks with her little pot of names. The team numbered 12 in total. The last person to take a name was their boss, Lewis Murray. He smiled and gave a hearty laugh as he saw the name. Then he thanked Abigail and the team settled back to work. Only most of the team were actually surreptitiously checking online websites for whoopee cushions and joke flowers for at least the next half an hour. Not long afterwards, Kevan got up and invited Abigail for a coffee in the breakout room. Sarah looked on with muted jealousy. She tried to reason with herself that it was his choice to have a coffee with whomsoever he chose, She just wished it was her. Sarah spent Sunday afternoon writing a Christmas letter to Santa with her son Connor. His list was fairly extensive, so she reminded him that Santa didn't buy everything on the list. "Okay, Mummy, can I put some stickers by the one I really want?" Connor asked. "That's a good idea, sweetheart," Sarah said. Carefully, Connor placed stickers next to the Astro Hero space rocket, which was number 3 on his list and carefully written in his best writing. Sarah craned her head over his shoulder and made a mental note of the list. She'd already got most of the items, but not the rocket toy. She'd need to look for it during her coffee break at work tomorrow. Luckily, work was happy to take in personal parcel deliveries. As long as Sarah ordered it now, it would be delivered in good time for Christmas. Happily, Connor sealed the letter, and together they wrapped up in coats and gloves against the hole to go and post the letter. Connor grabbed his scooter while Sarah held his special letter to Santa. Together they posted the letter in the postbox at the end of their road. Giving Connor a high five, mother and son walked on to the park so that Connor could ride his scooter. It was the perfect Sunday afternoon. When Sarah arrived at work the next day, she found that Abigail had been busy decorating their desks. Most monitors were covered in tinsel and little baubles hung from their desk lamps. It was a really kind thing to do. Sarah really couldn't understand why Abigail got under her skin. "Morning, Sarah," Kevan turned and greeted her with a kind smile. "Morning, Kevan," Sarah replied with her own warm smile and sat down at her desk. She logged onto her computer to check the most urgent emails. After she'd dealt with them, she got up for her coffee, and upon her return, she and Kevan had their usual morning chat. "How was your weekend?" Kevan asked her. "Oh, it was lovely, thanks. Connor and I were writing his letter together to Santa. He's doing so well with his writing. Connor really wants an Astro Hero space rocket this year, so I need to order it later today to make sure Santa is able to gift it in time for Christmas." Kevan smiled. "I wish I still believed in Santa. I know exactly what's on my wish list this year," and smiled a secret smile to himself. He continued, "I remember that feeling I got as a kid when I saw the stocking full of toys. It felt so magical." He smiled wistfully at the memory. Then, reconnecting his eyes with Sarah, he said, "You're a great mum, you know. Connor is lucky to have you." Sarah shook her head. "I worry. He sometimes feels like he's missing out by not having a father like the other children at school. I tried to list all his classmates that only have mums and not dads, but it doesn't help. The idealized Christmas family films doesn't help too. So I tried to be everything I can to him. Mum guilt, I guess." Kevan tried to reassure her. "You don't have to be everything to him. You are enough. He's a lucky little boy. It may look like everyone else has it sorted, but everyone has their difficulties. They just don't let it show. Think of the families where the dad is drunk or abusive. Think of the children that have lost both parents. There's a wide rainbow of normal when it comes to families." Kevan had turned his chair towards her as per normal and was giving her his undivided attention. He continued, "Just so you know, I think you do a great job." Sarah smiled. "Thanks, Kevan. It really means a lot." Sarah turned back to her work and exhaled, trying to let go of feeling not good enough. Later that day, Sarah took a 5-minute break to grab another coffee and search online for the coveted rocket toy. Much to her disappointment, the first few online stores she checked were already sold out. Sarah clicked her tongue in annoyance, and Kevan looked up from his work. Sarah checked some more smaller online stores, then did a general search. Click, click, click. Her desperation started to escape her as she made little noises of annoyance. Finally, she said out loud, "Oh, this is so frustrating." "Anything I can help you with?" Kevan looked over to her kindly. "It's nothing," Sarah said, shaking her head. "Really? Problem shared is a problem halved," Kevan persisted. Sarah hesitated, then said, "Connor really wants this rocket toy from Santa. I didn't realise it was going to be such an issue, but apparently it's in high demand and it's sold out. I can't find it anywhere." "Oh," Kevan said with concern, looking over to her computer. "What's it called?" "Astro Hero Space Rocket," Sarah replied, and tried to hide her frustration. "Let me have a check," Kevan kindly offered as he tapped the details into his search engine and clicked a few different sites. Sarah looked over hopefully, but Kevan's search was fruitless. "I can't seem to find it in stock either," he said sadly. "I'm really sorry." You never know, they may release more stock in a week or so. Perhaps just keep checking the websites? Yes, Sarah said dejectedly. Thanks for looking, Kevan. I really appreciate it. Any time, said Kevan, looking thoughtfully. He rubbed his fingers over his lips and returned to his work. The next couple of weeks continued to prove fruitless in the search for the coveted rocket toy, which apparently was the number one wanted toy this Christmas. Sarah had a horrible sinking feeling in her heart. She really felt like she was letting Connor down. Sarah confided in Kevan how awful she was feeling, how she felt like a failed mum. He tried to reassure her as best he could. Their boss, Lewis, walked by. Everything okay, Sarah? He asked. Absolutely, Lewis. All going well. The Morgan report is nearly finished and I'll have it on your desk by close of business today, Sarah brightly replied. Great, Lewis said and looked pleased at both Sarah and Kevan. They were great members of the team. No trouble at all. After Lewis left, Sarah said in a quiet whisper to Kevan, I've been so preoccupied with this rocket toy, I'd almost completely forgotten about the Secret Santa. I really need to get something. Our team lunch is in 2 days. How about you? Kevan smiled at her. Secret Santa? I've just about got that sorted. It's taken a bit of work. He smiled widely to himself as he tapped away at his keyboard. Sarah raised a quizzical eyebrow to him, but he didn't say anything else. Abigail bounded over to them and commanded Kevan's attention regarding a work issue, so Sarah turned back to her work and tried to tune them out. The team were excited that morning as it was the day of their annual Christmas team lunch, but Sarah was finding it hard to join in with the cheery Christmas spirit. All she could think about was Connor's disappointment when Santa didn't get him the toy he wanted this Christmas. This was the first Christmas lunch Sarah had attended with the team since joining, and overall she really enjoyed being in the group. Sarah had finally decided on a funny daily diary for Darren as a Secret Santa gift. He liked planning, so a diary to organise his time would fit well. On each day was a humorous motivational message such as, you can't have everything, you don't have the desk space, or I always inspired to be somebody one day. I realise now I should have been more specific. Sarah had wrapped it in suitably Christmassy paper and handed it to Abigail before lunch. The team started putting on their coats and grabbing their bags for their lunch out. Abigail bounded over to Kevan and fawned at his arm. Kevan, the Santa sack is a little big. Would you carry it for me? Sarah looked down at her locked computer screen and tried not to feel annoyed at Abigail touching Kevan. The team walked to the pub. Sarah walked with Kevan at the back of the group. He was carrying the enormous black bin bag of gifts. There were only 12 of them in the team, so it was surprising the amount of presents Secret Santa had generated. Sarah wondered if her present for Darren was enough, but Abigail had clearly stipulated a gift value of up to £10. Anyway, it was a secret. No one would know. Kevan sat across the table from Sarah at lunch, and much to Sarah's annoyance, Abigail placed herself right next to him. The rest of the team filed around the long, oblong, sticky pub table, decorated with festive candles and cheap red and green Christmas crackers. Lewis, their boss, stood up and gave a brief speech about fantastic team spirit and all the hard work they'd put in this year. He then looked gratefully over to Abigail for her excellent idea of the team Christmas Secret Santa this year. Excitedly, Abigail stood up and went to the black bin bag she'd placed in the corner to start distributing the presents around. Jingly Christmas music played in the background of the pub as the team sipped drinks and waited to be passed their Secret Santa present. Presents were passed around the group to much hilarity and the ripping of paper. Lewis, their boss, was given a pair of pink furry handcuffs. Most of the team laughed, some a little uncertainly. Sarah tried to look away, but it seemed that their boss had taken the joke well and was laughing heartily at the end of the table. Phew. From the bag, Abigail withdrew a huge box wrapped in blue penguin paper. Abigail looked a little annoyed as she said, "This one's for you, Sarah." "Oh," Sarah replied, "it's huge." She looked a little embarrassed as the team members helped Abigail to pass it over to Sarah. "Open it," one of her colleagues shouted over to her. With a puzzled brow, Sarah started to rip off the wrapping paper and revealed, "An Astro Hero space rocket," Sarah said. She couldn't believe it. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the box around in her hands and checked inside to make sure it was the real thing. "That's an odd present," Abigail said, and shot an angry look at Kevan next to her. Sarah looked up to see Abigail looking cross and Kevan looking directly at her. Lewis, their boss, shouted down the table. You planning on a career change? Most of the team laughed. Sarah shook her head no and carefully placed her gift under the table. From across the table, Abigail looked as if she'd eaten a lemon. It was, quite frankly, the best gift Sarah had ever received. It was almost as if someone knew. Sarah shot a few looks at Kevan during lunch, but he didn't say anything. Sarah looked over to her boss, Lewis. Perhaps it was him. Sarah looked around her team. Could be anyone, really, except Abigail. Whoever it was, Sarah was grateful. The team returned to work after lunch in high spirits. Sarah hadn't realised how stressed and worried she'd been about the rocket toy. She finally felt she was able to relax and laugh along with the Christmas spirit. Carefully placing the present under her desk at work, Sarah went to grab a coffee. Kevan had popped down to the mailroom to collect something, and Abigail was typing furiously at her desk. Returning from the tea room, Sarah happily sat down and logged into her computer. Taking one last glance under her desk at the coveted rocket toy, to her horror, Sarah saw it was gone. Sarah felt physically sick. Within the space of a couple of hours, she'd gone from feeling completely rubbish at not being able to source the rocket toy, to elation and joy at the Christmas spirit that someone knew and had been kind enough to buy it for her and for her to give to her son. Then, in the worst possible turn of bad luck, someone else had taken it. Sarah looked around her team and behind her at the rest of the office. Who would do such a mean thing? Sarah crouched down on her hands and knees under her desk, just in case the large box had been pushed aside. From behind her, she heard Kevan say, "Looking for this?" Sarah scrambled up from the floor. She saw Kevan standing over her, holding the lost Astro Heroes space rocket box. "Oh my goodness," she said. "You found it! What happened? Where was it?" Kevan set his mouth to a hard line. "I ordered some specialist motorbike wheels. I went down to the mailroom to collect them and went out the back door of the mailroom to take them to the car. I found Abigail out back about to throw this into the skip." "What?" Sarah said. "She said you'd asked her to get rid of the box, so I checked it, but I found the toy was still inside. I thought you might still want it." Sarah gratefully clutched the box to her. "Thank you," she said tearfully. "Thank you so much. You don't know what this means to me." In relief, Sarah shakily sat down and carefully placed the box beside her. Abigail suddenly rushed over to them, saying, "Oh, Sarah, I tried to dispose of that box that you asked me to, but Kevan wanted it." She gave a high-pitched laugh. Sarah replied, "I didn't ask you to dispose of the box." "Yes, you did," Abigail asserted. "Perhaps you've forgotten. You must have meant a different box." "No," Sarah said coldly. "Oh well, no harm done," Abigail replied. Sarah and Kevan exchanged glances, and Kevan said, "I have an idea, Sarah. Why don't I take this down to my car and drop it off to you tonight when Connor's gone to bed?" Sarah looked at him gratefully. "Oh, that would be really kind. Thank you," she replied. Abigail could hardly contain her rage as she blurted out, "Well, just so you know, it was Kevan that bought you the Secret Santa present anyway." Sourness stained her face as she stared at Sarah. "I don't think it's very good. He asked me to change Secret Santa names, so I did. Just so you know, I don't really think it's part of the team spirit. In fact, I think it's odd, and perhaps I ought to talk to Lewis about it." "That's right," said Kevan. "I changed out names for our boss Lewis, whom I believe you bought pink furry handcuffs. Don't think his wife will be pleased if she was to find that out." Abigail stood for a few seconds in repressed rage. Unable to think of anything profound, she finally managed a fake smile and said, "I don't think I'll do Secret Santa next year. Happy Christmas," before flouncing off. Sarah was shocked. She'd always had a bad feeling about Abigail, but she still couldn't believe she'd do something like that. Connor was just a kid. What she did was mean. Kevan broke her thoughts by picking up the much-valued toy and saying, "I hope it's okay. What time do you want me to come around tonight?" Looking over to Kevan with love and gratitude in her eyes, Sarah said, "Would 8 p.m. be okay?" Kevan smiled. "That would be perfect. See you tonight," and left for his car with the present safely under his arm. Sarah put Connor to bed, brushed her teeth, refreshed her makeup, and tried not to feel excited as she waited for Kevan to knock on the door. She didn't know what was going to happen, but somehow she felt that things had changed. Secrets weren't secrets anymore. Perhaps she'd be brave enough to tell Kevan how she felt. Sarah sat in the sitting room of her little terraced house, waiting. She was a bundle of nerves. At a few minutes past 8, there was a knock at the door. Checking out of her bay window, Sarah could see Kevan in the light from the streetlights. It felt strange to see someone she knew so well in a different location. Excitedly, Sarah rushed around to the door to open it. Sarah ushered Kevan inside her house and gratefully received the rocket toy. She was so incredibly lucky. Sarah breathed a big sigh of relief and said, "Thank you so much, Kevan, for driving this over tonight. You don't know what this means to me." Kevan raised an eyebrow at her. "Actually, I think I do. I do sit next to you every day." Sarah smiled and continued, "I really appreciate it. And you swapped Secret Santa names with Abigail. I'm surprised she agreed. How did you know she had my name?" Kevan replied. "Kevan? Well, to be completely honest," Kevan looked nervously at his feet as he stood in Sarah's hallway. Too much university poker?" Sarah looked confused, so Kevan continued. "I got the sense Abigail didn't like you that much. So when she pulled a name out of the pot and rolled her eyes, I correctly guessed it was your name. As I had Lewis's name, I guess she'd much prefer to try and score points with the boss than buy something for you. So I took a gamble, and I was right." "But you didn't know about the rocket toy at that point. I didn't tell you until after," Sarah said, a puzzled expression still over her brow. "No, that's right, you didn't." Kevan looked even more embarrassed as he decided to make a clean breast of it. "In truth, I wanted to get you a Secret Santa present. I wasn't initially intending to get one for Connor, but then I saw how worried and upset you were, and I thought you'd much prefer this. I hope you don't mind." Sarah smiled widely at him. "I don't mind at all. The gift is perfect. You have really made my Christmas." "I have?" he said hopefully. Bravely, Sarah said, "I don't suppose you'd like to stop for a while, for a tea or coffee or something?" Kevan smiled adoringly at Sarah. "Thank you. I'd like that very much." For the first time in what would be a ritual that would be repeated hundreds of times in their future life together, Sarah went through to the kitchen to put on the kettle and make a cup of tea for Kevan.